We can continue our look today at the one another passages. I think this one is probably one that has a negative tone, but I think it's really intended to be in a positive light. We don't often think about this passage as being a passage that encourages, but that is the design of what the Hebrew writer is trying to get at here. I always think of an illustration in life in the realm of sport, like a coach. The word coach means to move somebody from one place to another. And a coach is there to move his players from one place to another, from a certain point of proficiency to a greater point of proficiency at whatever it is they do. And the Hebrew writer here is trying to move us, and sometimes it happens in the most unlikely places, and I think this is where the context of this passage finds itself. Now, if you notice the illustration of the spur right there, this is one of the most interesting passages to me, just because it just seems to be a contradiction. To spur one another on. I always think of horses. I think of the spur on a rider's boot as he tries to make the horse do what he wants and tries to get more out of the horse. Some of you may not know, but my father was a jockey. It was the first job he had. He rode horses for a living. You wonder how he produced a child this big. I don't know. I'm a giant in my family, even though I'm not a giant among you. When he was riding, he was only 5 foot tall, he weighed 100 pounds, and he wore a size 4 shoe. He was that way until he was 26 years old. I don't know how they stunted their growth. I always asked him how they did it, but he never revealed the secret. I don't think it was anything good. He grew 6 inches from the time he was 26 years old into his early 30s, which is really unusual. Needless to say, when I started enjoying basketball as a sport, I thought maybe that growth spurt would kick in with me, but it did not. But I think of this passage when I think of him, because he loved horses so much. And I think as Texans, I can only imagine what Texans would have done to the horse racing industry. I can just imagine a bunch of Texans with boots on, with spurs on, riding down. You can't do it, not in a professional horse race. If you can imagine what a professional rider does, though he doesn't use a spur, he uses a crop, right? A riding crop. I remember as a kid, I always thought it was kind of cruel. When the rider wanted the horse to go faster, he would reach out and he'll start pounding that horse with that crop. My father said, no, it doesn't hurt that much. Just enough to get the horse going. I don't think the Hebrew writer here is intending to hurt us with this passage. He's not intending us to use this passage to hurt other people, but just enough to get us going. So from Hebrews 10 and 24, the writer says, and let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds. Notice the phrase there, to consider. I think many times when we get into a verbal altercation with somebody, we just react to what they're saying. It's just an instinct. Somebody will say something, we'll counter that particular statement. We'll try to defend ourselves. We'll try to save our pride. We'll try to look good in front of other people. But if you notice the phrase that we consider what we are about to do, this takes forethought and planning. We've got to be careful when we approach each other, when we're going to try to do what the writer here wants us to do for each other. There are times when we need to go to somebody and put our arm around them, and the words need to be tender and sweet. Usually that's the best way. But sometimes the words need to be like this. They need to be a spur. And the word there for spur is the Greek word paroxysmos. Paroxysmos, as you can see, is defined in 2 slightly different ways. One would be to incite, and it has a negative connotation to it at times, to dispute. But Vine says it's to provoke. And provoke can be either way. Provoke could be either positive or negative. But I want us to think about the word in light of what the writer is saying, that we consider how we are going to do this. It's not just a reaction to what somebody else says or does. It's something we've taken time to consider before we say what we're about to say. I think we need to think of the illustration of the coach. The coach is trying to move his players from one place to another. I think the writer here is trying to get us to think of another tool that we could use to move people from one place to another. Now, maybe you can think in your life of times when someone has come up to you and has said some things that you would rather not hear. It doesn't mean you should have heard them. It just means you would rather not hear them. It doesn't mean that they weren't true. It just meant that you didn't like them. It didn't mean that the words would not provoke you to do something different. It's just that you didn't want to hear what they had to do. You didn't want to hear what they had to make you do. I think if we're going to push people's buttons, we need to make sure we're moving them somewhere. I think the writer here is trying to get us to think about what we say before we say it, not just react, but consider what your words may do to push somebody to improve. I remember I was still in college and I was asked to teach an adult Bible class. It was a mixed Bible class, so we had everybody in there from people maybe in their 20s up to some adults maybe in their 70s or 80s. And the class had about 30 or 40 people in it. And I had a series of lessons I was going to do over 12 weeks. And I was going through the series, and I thought I was doing a pretty decent job. And one day, one of the older gentlemen in the class came up to me after class and put his arm around me and said, "When you teach, you're not just teaching for 45 minutes. You're not just using 45 minutes of time. You're using up 30 people's 45 minutes of time. Think of how much time you're wasting if you don't do it right." And I thought about that. I thought, was he trying to encourage me? Or was he trying to discourage me? I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I thought, maybe he was trying to spur me to think about what I was doing. I wasn't just wasting 45 minutes of my time. I was wasting 45 minutes of everyone's time in that room. He chose his words carefully, and they've always stuck with me. And I've always thought about that. Don't waste the time that I'm given. It wasn't the words I necessarily wanted to hear, but it was the words that I needed to hear. Would you rather have somebody make you feel good, placate you? Would you rather have somebody flatter you? Or would you rather have somebody tell you something that would really move you forward, would really change what you're doing, really have an impact on you? Sometimes it's going to take something like this. So I want you to think about the fact that just because there may be this seeming conflict, just because it may seem negative, it doesn't mean it can't change you as a Christian and move you forward. It doesn't mean it can't advance your faith. It doesn't mean it won't increase your faith. If we give others the benefit of the doubt that they're looking out for our best interest, then maybe we will see this move as something that is positive. Now, how many times have you been at a ball game, doesn't matter what sport it is, and the coach yells out something out onto the field, onto the court, and to you as a spectator it comes across really negative. But you see, the coach knows something you don't. He knows something about that player or those players that he may be able to put something in there and spur them on. And to us it comes across as negative. But to them they remember. They remember what has taken place in practice. Perhaps it's something good that they focus on, the glory of winning, or perhaps it's something they think about, which is the loss that they might feel if the changes aren't made. We need to be that person. The writer here is telling us we need to be that person that deliberately says these things to make the changes in somebody else's life. You'll remember in the Bible, Paul and Barnabas had a dispute. And from this passage out of Acts chapter 15, we have this event. Notice the underlined portion in verse 39. It says they had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. And you remember it was at this point that Paul goes back and revisits the churches they'd been at and takes along Silas, and Barnabas takes along with him John Mark. This is the writer of the book of Mark. This is the one who had disappointed Paul, and Paul didn't want to take him along because his faith wavered at times. And so Barnabas, the son of encouragement, as his word describes, is trying to encourage John Mark. And it has an impact. But at this point, Paul didn't see that as the time to do that. And so him and Barnabas separate. That very phrase there, that sharp disagreement, is this word right here, paroxysmos. But notice what it did. Even though it divided their efforts, it sent them in two locations and not one. The work did not stop. It did not change who Barnabas was, and it certainly did not change who Paul was. Even though later Paul would say that John Mark would be useful for him if he could join them. Just because something appears negative, or just because there is something we don't want to hear, it doesn't mean it can't have that positive effect on us. It doesn't mean that it can't move our faith forward. I think this is something we need to realize and come to terms with and appreciate. Because how many times have we not heard somebody say, that person said this or that to me, and I didn't like what they had to say, so I am leaving. Or how many times have you felt where you were in a conversation where something like this was taking place and you didn't like what you were hearing and you're thinking to yourself, if only I could be somewhere else right now. And maybe you even switched off your mind and you said to yourself, I'm not listening to another word this person says. I think you missed something very valuable. I think today, more so than any other period of time, as human beings, we dislike criticism so much. We're afraid of it. Everybody's afraid of perhaps hearing something they don't like to hear. You've probably heard it on television, on the news. There are certain colleges that have safe places for the weak little people to go because they're going to hear something they don't like to hear. There are a lot of things I don't like to hear. But I don't have a safe place I can go. I have to deal with it. As Christians, if we don't understand what we did when we entered the waters of baptism, we're not going to understand what this idea of spurring one another on is. You see, because when we entered the waters of baptism, we yielded to God's law. And we said, no matter what happens, we don't care what man says, we're going to live for God from this point on. You see, the truth is something we should love. The truth is something we should desire, something we should seek, something we should want to hear all the time. So when someone begins to tell us what we are really like, we need to listen very carefully. I've shared this story with you before. But when I was growing up, going through school, if you got in trouble, you went to the office, and it usually meant, if it was bad enough and you were going to the office, the teacher would send a little notebook with it and would have the description of what you did wrong. And that would determine how many lashes you were going to get by the principal. So depending on how bad the crime was, you were going to get punished. It was always a guess. I always looked in the book as I was walking along. I wonder what this one is. Is this a 2 or 3? When I got there, I was always surprised. But then, we were taught that after the principal meters out the punishment, and while your rear end is still stinging, and your face is doing this, you've got to reach out your hand and say, "Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir." How many times do we think of someone who says something to us that we don't want to hear, and then we reach out our hand and we say, "Thank you, sir." Because if I understand what is happening to me, I needed that, didn't I? Didn't I need that? Didn't I need that discipline? When somebody confronts you and they begin to tell you something that you've done wrong, don't you need to hear that? I've always said to think about the gospel and what it means to share it with the lost world is so important. The world is lost. It is always lost until you say something, until you do something about it. If you want to really hurt the world, keep your mouth shut. Don't say anything. Don't offer a solution. Don't help. But you see, that's the easy way, right? Just to keep quiet. Just to let it go on. The world doesn't want to hear what you have to say, because the truth does hurt. It is uncomfortable. It's not popular. It doesn't make us feel good. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't hear it. One of my favorite passages is Proverbs 27:17. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Now we think about that proverb. At some point in a conflict, one of us is going to be the file. And one of us is going to be the object that is going to be filed upon. But if you notice what the writer here is saying is that this is a mutual thing. It's back and forth. Spur one another on. It's not just one person just riding you all the time. As iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another. There are going to be times when you have what needs to be heard and you need to say it. And there are times where I need to listen and I need to listen. But then there are also times when that is reversed and it's time for you to listen and it's time for me to speak. I think unless there is a level of trust that we should have, that we're on the same journey, that we're trying to get to the same place, we're not going to want to hear what is being said. Too many times, perhaps, we use our own wisdom. We use our own logic. And that's probably why we get in trouble. I don't think the writer here is saying that you should have your way or your opinion. I think he's saying you should have the way and have God's mind and share the way, God's mind, with those around you. It doesn't matter what else comes in our way, whatever conflict we may have. They don't have any impact on us eternally. They don't have any impact on us spiritually. We can see by the context of the passage where the writer is trying to go with this spurring. It is not negative, it is positive. So what should we provoke one another to do? I'm sure you can remember as a child growing up, because you learnt your siblings' weaknesses so well, you knew just what buttons to push, right? You knew what words brought out certain emotions. You knew what topics to hit. You knew what memories to bring back to mind, what events We're good at that, aren't we? But that is negative. Can we use those same events differently? Can we use those same events to promote somebody? To push them forward? From this Hebrews passage, he says the answer is toward love and good deeds. Almost seems like a contradiction, doesn't it? That's why I think the passage is so difficult. Can I get into a heated discussion with somebody and push that person in the direction of love and making the right decision, but at the same time allowing that person to realize that I'm trying to do what is best for them? It's not what I want. It's what God wants for them. It's not my plan for them. It's His plan for them. To be able to be in the position to receive that kind of information, we have to go back to how it started. There has to be a yielding spirit within us. We have to put aside our opinion, our pride, our goals, our vision, our likes, our dislikes. We have to put those aside. If we see that someone is trying to push us towards making this right decision, if we see somebody moving us towards love, then we can begin to understand where they're coming from. The provocation is to do the right thing, not the wrong thing. We know what this word love means, so we look at the two definitions. One is toward love is the sacrificial love, but that second one, notice the words there, kalos ergon. Kalos ergon. We're not familiar with kalos because we just don't use that very often. But the negative sometimes tells us a little bit about it. The negative word for kalos is kakos. And from kakos we get the word kaka. You know what kaka means? Maybe you don't use it. In Africa it's a real popular saying. When you're changing a child's diaper, there's usually kaka in the diaper. It's not good. It's bad. It's evil. But here the writer is trying to focus on the opposite of that. He's saying kalos ergon, good work or beautiful work. I think it puts it in a whole different light. It's not just that we're trying to make somebody have right thinking, that their minds make good choices. But if you look at the phrase there, kalos ergon, it means we're going to encourage people to make beautiful works. God is looking at the things that we are going to do as highly important. First of all, that they're sacrificial. If it's sacrificial, it's not about the one who is saying it. It's about the one who's receiving it. The one who is saying it is making the sacrifice by saying the words that are being said. And the encouragement to do good deeds is not just good deeds. They're beautiful works. We don't think of the good deeds that we're doing as beautiful. This is how God sees them. I think if we look at these two phrases, we realize that the one who is spurring us on is focusing on good things only. Sacrificial love and beautiful works. That's not easy to do. It's not easy to take something that could be a very volatile discussion and in the end be promoting something that is good. Doesn't mean we're going to go away feeling good about it. We live in a day and time where feelings rule. One of my biggest pet peeves about human wisdom and human advice is this: And you always see this. A father talks to his children, his son or his daughter, and they asking about this big moral dilemma perhaps they have in their life. And the parent, the father or the mother, turns to the child and says, follow your heart. Follow your heart. Worst bit of advice you can ever give anybody. It's exactly the opposite end of the spiritual spectrum. If you want to get in trouble, follow your heart. See where it leads you. If you want to do the right thing, as the writer says here, it's through sacrificial love and beautiful deeds. It's on the other end of the spectrum. Because when somebody is spurring you on, there's nothing good about that, except where they're trying to move you. You leave the conversation feeling discouraged because of what you feel. But if you think about what has been done, if you think about what has been said, then you understand where that person is trying to move you. In our day and time, we focus so much on the feelings. We talked about it in class this morning. I'd mentioned the passage out of Acts chapter 20 where Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. It goes back to that word of sacrificial love. So you're trying to tell me it's better if I lose? You're trying to tell me, God, it's better if I give something away that's valuable to me? Are you trying to say I need to feel the loss? Are you trying to tell me I need to be less than I am right now? Yes, that's a spiritual way. Because only then will we begin to understand what that feels like. And the real feeling we should have is the blessing of giving stuff away. If someone who cares about you comes to you in a difficult circumstance and sacrifices their friendship to steer you in the right direction, you need to put your hand out and thank them. If you go to somebody like this, you are risking the good feelings that you once had. To rather have the bad feelings, but yet move that person forward spiritually. I want to leave you with this thought this morning. Do you provoke others to anger and bad behavior? Or do you provoke others towards love and good deeds? See, anybody can provoke towards anger and bad behavior. We're good at that. We start off at a very young age. It takes time for us to realize that we can pick our words carefully. We can pick our fights carefully. And we can try to move people in the right direction. Because we need to realize as Christians the biblical principle that whatever we do for others, we want them to do for us in return, don't we? True love means I'm going to do for you what later I hope and pray that you will do for me. Wouldn't you want, at that moment when you need to make that kind of decision, for someone to come up and to confront you and say, you can't do that? I know you want to do it, but you can't do it. This is what you have to do. I know you're not going to like it, but you're going to have to do that if you're going to be right with God. We have to decide today what we're going to do. And our prayer for each one of us in this room should be to have the courage to do it. It is not popular today to be the one who spurs others on to love and good deeds. It is not popular. Many, even in this room, will not understand. And the world certainly will not understand. As the coach yells out to his players on the court or on the field. And they understand. To the bystanders, to the spectators, they do not. But the coach is communicating something really important to his players. I encourage you to think about the position you hold when you see someone who needs to hear words that they don't want to hear, that you have the courage to say them. We have a song that's prepared at this moment. If you need the help of the church in any way, this will be your opportunity to respond. If you've been studying and know what it means to be a Christian, the waters of baptism are ready. We can take care of that right now if you would respond as we stand, as we sing together.